Nicholas.
Here. Okay, we've got 3 bills lined up for this evening. The first bill is, we'll do Senate File 159, which is the Stop ESG Eliminate Economic Boycott Act. Do we have anyone on as the sponsors who want to present this bill to us? Seeing no one. Yeah, why don't, let's do that. Actually, Representative Walters, you want to just kind of give us a quick synopsis of the bill?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Senate File 159, and this is in regards to contracting and ESG standards when the state or political subdivisions of the state are going into contracts and doing RFPs for various types of work to be done in the state of Wyoming. And this bill would make it to where those companies that were showing an economic boycott against businesses that are doing good work for the state of Wyoming would receive basically a demerit for that, having that kind of a policy in place. And that's how I would best describe it.
Mr. Chairman, go ahead.
So Representative Walters, before we get into public comment, is your understanding from reading the bill that they, in the process, the procurement process, that in the bill, they wait until the firm is selected and they're at the point of doing contract before then the ESG conversation takes place, or how does that work?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My reading of it, which could be incorrect, is this takes place up front as the contracts are being sought.
And Mr. Chairman, if I can follow up, are you under the impression, is this just a state agencies, or who has to comply with this requirement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 7, the top of the page, Romanet III or 3, government entity means any state, means the state, University of Wyoming, any local government or any agency, board, or commissions thereof, which I would take to mean basically public type entities are the ones that would be required to abide by this ESG standard.
Thank you. We're trying.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, let's just go to public comment on the bill. I think the committee understands the bill, and we've gone through it fairly extensively. So please come on up. Anyone who wants to have public comment.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Nephi Cole. I'm the Director of Government Relations and State Affairs for the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the Firearms Trade Association of America. My name is spelled N-E-P-H-I-C-O-L-E. Thank you for considering and having a discussion about this important issue. It's a very challenging issue, and I expect that in this hearing, you're going to have to make some very tough choices. This bill ultimately is very much like 20 plus BDS bills or anti-Israel BDS sanction bills that exist throughout the country, as well as a few other bills in other states like the Financial Industry Non-Discrimination Act, which was passed in Texas as SB 19 roughly 2 years ago. It's a choice bill, so 159 hopefully provides Wyoming a choice. The bill here is here because of choices in people's boardrooms that are outside of your borders. As early as the 1990s, activists who opposed my industry, having failed at using representative government, began leveraging third parties to deny access to the necessities of fair business. Things like credit, access to banking, insurance, and in other areas. In our industry, we saw primarily efforts to deny financial services, and these are well documented. To be clear, Wyoming's companies do not do this. This is a trend that's large national companies typically participate in. But a choice was made in those boardrooms under pressure from activists to deny fair access to some services to disfavored industries. Those discriminatory companies will say that free market capitalism gives them the right to make that choice, and we respect that. That's fair. But in the same vein of argument, we believe that you, decision makers from the state of Wyoming, also get a choice. You are the appropriators of the state of Wyoming. Wyoming and its local governments should absolutely have the same type of choice that these businesses say they want, to decide to do business with companies that represent your values. This bill, at its most fundamental, if it can be synthesized down to that, is about four things. If a company seeks your dollars and they have made a decision to discriminate against certain services to lawful businesses, they have to tell you about it. So that's what this bill does. It's a disclosure bill. In the process, they can check a box that says we don't discriminate, or if we do, we have a discriminatory policy. We will not provide services to a coal company or a gun company categorically because we choose that. And that's what those companies have chosen. They've done it. If they do that, the state then should have this is the second part, should have the opportunity to decide if it wants to do business with that company or with another company that can provide the same service that does not have that discriminatory policy. If you can't find another company to do business with that doesn't have the discriminatory policy, this bill then allows any government entity to continue doing business with a company that does have the discriminatory policy. Without question, all they have to do is in writing say, we chose to do business with the discriminating entity because of this reason, whether it be statutory or fiduciary responsibility. They can go ahead and do that. They just have to verify it. The only way that anybody gets in trouble with this bill is if they lied to you, is if they claim that they don't have a discriminatory policy to you, but then tomorrow, and this has happened, they sit down in front of a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. and say, we will not do business with companies that, for example, make military style firearms. That's a real thing. It happens. It's happened. If they do that, this is the last part of the bill, you should have the ability through your legal entities to seek cancellation of that contract if it is in the best interest of the state. And those are choices that you should get to make. We believe this is appropriate. We believe it's fair. We respect that companies get to make these choices. We might not like it, but it is what it is. We believe you should get to know about it if they have those policies. We believe it's appropriate that the citizens whose tax dollars are going into companies that discriminate against lawful industries, that they should get to know. We think that your constituents have an expectation that you will know that. If you determine that you must use company A versus company B because of your charge, you can do so, as long as you know what's going on and you're making the best decisions on behalf of the people of the state of Wyoming. And we believe that that's what this bill does. And we hope that you will give it consideration and discussion, and that we can be helpful in answering any questions about it, whether now or in the future. So thank you very much for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, questions for? So I've got a couple different questions. So basically, this is mandating a vetting process for every contract over $1,000. Is that a fair characterization of it?
So, Mr. Chairman, it's members of the committee, it's my understanding that the bill does, in fact, it doesn't define exactly what that process looks like, but yes, it says if you have there's a threshold contract, and these thresholds look different in different states. For example, in a state further to your south, that's right on the border with perhaps another country, it's going to look like a $100,000 contract. Some of these bills in other states have provisions that they only apply to companies that have more than $1 billion or $100 billion in assets. So the floor that you have in front of you is it's a $1,000 contract. Yes, you'd have to check that.
And so, but before you can even enter into a contract, they've got to find out or have a verification of any and all vendors who want to be or you know, that any bid that goes out for any item in the state of Wyoming, or in addition to that, any county, UW, all have to vet out who is qualified in order even to bid. Is that an accurate description?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it's my understanding and this is how it is elsewhere, it's a self-certification. So simply where you ask a company, for example, if they discriminate against a certain religious entity or a protected class, in that same vein, which you do with all of your contracts right now, you would ask if they have a discriminatory policy as defined, a boycott policy in your statute. So yes, they would have to self-certify like they do today with those other issues, whether or not they had a policy like that on the books.
Sure. Go ahead.
Mr. Cole. The green button, come on. I know that you've worked along this issue in a number of other states. Have you seen other states at the state level impose this on the cities, towns, counties, and political subdivisions to this? Is it to the same extent? It seems.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes. So for Texas is a great example. SB 19 applies to all of your local and municipal bonding as well. So it does apply not just to the state, but also to local governments in that case. It is not that case in every state, but it is that way in some of the states that have these laws like Texas.
Mr. Chairman. And then how would this also apply? I'm thinking on our highway system where YDOT lets out a bid, but then the contractor is required to have bonding in those financial institutions, as you pointed out, may be that. So then does the state require the contractor who's bidding to then conform to this in your mind, or how does that, because they're not signing the contract, they're signing the contract with the contractor. The contractor has to get bonding through a financial entity. How far removed does this impact go?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Larson, it's my understanding and that I believe that this bill does not apply to second and third parties. I believe it only applies to the entity that signs the initial contract.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think that's correct. The way I read this, before they can sign a contract, they have to say that the folks that they supply them also.
Mr. Chairman.
In the discriminatory practice.
And absolutely respecting your reading of it, you may be correct. And so my reading of it may be incorrect. I'm not the sponsor, this is not, we support this bill. And I wish that some other folks were here to answer questions about it, but I will do my best.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So Mr. Cole, the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund has over $8 billion in it. There are a lot of investment contracts that the state has. So walk me through an example. To get the most out of our investments, we have some long-term contracts, for example, where you would put $100 million into with a private equity fund, say for 5 or 7 years. Let's imagine we do that, and at the time we enter into the contract, they certify that yes, they don't discriminate against any kind of business so long as they're engaging in a lawful business. And then 2 years later, they change management and decide they'll no longer invest in firearms companies or no longer invest in fossil fuels companies. So it seems like this bill would then require the state to divest itself of that investment early, right? And typically you'd have a penalty associated with that, $5 or $10 million penalty. Is it contemplated then that the state of Wyoming would just lose, say, $5 or $10 million because we have to get out of that investment early?
So Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, while I believe you have some folks here who are going to be able to talk to some of those details, it would to a greater degree from the treasurer's office. But my understanding is that the way that 159 is written, which is quite different than the other bill you'll be considering, is that this bill has an out clause where any executive who needs to make a decision regarding that can make the decision that is not in the fiduciary best interest of the state of Wyoming to exit any contract that they were in. I believe that out clause does apply. That's my reading of it.
So I think the out clause in this bill says if it's inconsistent with the constitutional statutory duties, or it's prevent the governmental entity from attaining goods and services to be provided in an economically practical manner. That's your out clause. That's not much of an out clause. What's economical is, for one thing, is if you, just doesn't mean you make as much money. So I think that's kind of the question on this particular bill. Go ahead.
So Nephi, maybe the biggest lesson is to never be the first one up. But what I'm trying to figure out, because, you know, as we hear those companies that really generate the revenue for our state and the impacts of some of these decisions from global players are having impact as you indicated. But yet where I'm struggling a little bit is when we come down to the town of Hudson, who may need to get an attachment for their backhoe, because it doesn't take much to get over $1,000. And I realize we can change that, but there's some practicality components to that. And that's why I was asking you about other states. But you know, as we try and work through this and figure this out and try to do this, I think that there's some components of this bill that I struggle with, and I don't know. For example, you get into where the district attorney, the attorney general, and the district attorney, where a violation takes place, can enforce the act, but then in the next one, only the attorney general can move forward. They leave the district attorney out, and you know, they talk about the evils of corporations in here, but most of the companies you represent too are corporations, and there's not much of a definition defining the applicable entities. You know, it's hard for me to track in one component in the findings, or there's a definition undefined, and I'm trying to track through that. And so as I've read the bill, I've probably read it 10 times now and have lots of notes, but do you find some ambiguity there as you've read through our version? I know that you've read a lot of states. It almost looks like we've tried to glean from a lot of different sources and combine into one, and maybe that's not, you know, our job is to have a good bill. And I'm not sure as I read that, but I'm just wondering if when you read it, if you find some inconsistencies or some gaps in there that you know, you're thinking maybe I done the drafting or something.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, like, those are really deep waters, Representative Larson. And certainly I would say the depth of the bill that you have in front of you is certainly, I think, challenging. And that's why I think it's important to try and break it down to what we feel like are the kind of 4 salient points that the bills need to have to work, because we realize that this one does, it's a significant lift, you know, moving through the different portions of the bill. That said, the water is deep, but we hope it doesn't get too muddy, because we think it's very important that this issue gets addressed.
Thank you.
So, yeah, in other words, if we just leave firearms and take out energy, timber, mining, and agriculture, you'd be okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I cannot speak on behalf of those other interests. I can tell you that, you know, we certainly, this bill has there's a lot in this bill. There's a lot of entities, a lot of interests. What we can say is with certainty, the harm against our industry is not theoretical. It is real, it's happening, it's documented. And so while we realize that there is a certain desire to get out in front of some of these other concepts and things that, you know, could occur that could be important to the state, we do believe that there are certain industries that are identified in this bill that are, without, excuse the pun, under the gun.
So, obviously, the whole state of Wyoming is a target in that sense, just giving our fossil fuel background. The question is, are we biting off our nose in spite of our face? If, for example, if we can't work with a company, several of our investment firms who provide a 6.5% return on our income. And so I'm kind of, because that happens in both of these bills, and it impacts those type of contracts. We enter into hundreds of and thousands of contracts, probably on a yearly basis. And every one of those would have to require this verification concept. And so, so it's a lot of hoops to go through, number one, but I don't think it'll be possible for us to do this without losing money or losing the ability to get the best product for the best price for Wyoming. And so you're asking us to balance the state of Wyoming's interest behind your interest in a sense. I mean, we're obviously pro-gun here, as pro as you can possibly get. On the other hand, if we work with a BlackRock company that's investing $1.5 billion and they have an anti-automatic weapon provision, just that alone is enough. We can't do business with. I mean, does that make sense? I mean, from the state standpoint, we're just trying to be practical about it. I mean, that's kind of what our job is.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, submit that that's why a few things are very important in this bill. One, that you do have the opportunity, if you don't have another viable option, to be able to do business where you need to do business. And the other thing that's very interesting about a bill like this is it does create it brings up a very challenging question, which is, what is a right worth? And what is the value to the people of the state of Wyoming of being able to exercise a right? And it's hard to put a value on that and determine, what that value should be.
Go ahead.
Nephi, in the other states that you worked with representing your industry, did you find that, did they ever separate maybe some of these industries out in separate bills? Or this seems like we've put energy, we put guns, we put agriculture, we put maple syrup. We've got it all in this thing. Is that what other states have done, or have they tried to maybe move that out and really define the needs of a particular industry and then come over and do? What have you seen?
No, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson. So the trend of the kind of omnibus type ESG bill, I think that is fairly new. So we've seen there's about 20 bills like this in moving right now. Some states have taken the solution of, for example, the BDS legislation in Utah that prohibits contracting with an entity that has a discriminatory policy against the state of Israel. They've taken the step of adding language into that existing statute that covers certain industries. And so it, relative, in many cases, it depends on who shows up to, talk about the bills. West Virginia has standalone for energy companies, so fossil fuel companies. Of course, Texas has standalone for firearms, but also has another bill that scoops in other entities. And so it really runs the gamut in terms of how states have chosen to deal with it.
Thank you.
So, and just to follow up, I'm now on page 10, it says the Attorney General shall make investigations to determine that this act has been violated. And you give him or any party affected and essentially direct that to happen. And you can have them produce evidence, compel the production of documents from from anybody. Why is that language in there?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, all I can say is that there are some nuances to this bill in Wyoming that don't exist in some of the other states. And so some of the clauses that are in here, that would be one of them, are stronger than what we have seen in the past in some of our other states, where we've worked on the Financial Industry Non-Discrimination Act for firearms. I do think you'll see language very similar to the language that's in front of you. in other states, again, that are, where these similar bills have been brought, but I can't really speak to those. I apologize.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
so Mr. Cole, and I apologize, you're the first witness, so you get all the questions. I apologize for that, but it seems like this is really broad. Take an example of a company, say a small town here that wants to do a water treatment plant and it needs variable frequency drives for its water pumps. And would like to buy them from, say, a corporation in, say, Europe that's really good at it. But that country may itself impose requirements for green energy or whatever that are anti-fossil fuel. And so the company, which may not care about environmental concerns, nonetheless forced by its government to have a, sort of an economic boycott as defined here. It seems like this bill would imply that then, a municipality in Wyoming can't buy those variable frequency drives or those pumps from that company. It seems like it really limits the market. Is that, in your view, is that sort of an acceptable price to pay for us to be politically correct in after our own fashion?
Mr. Chairman,
I think that's
Representatives.
a leading question.
I'm not sure I can answer the question on behalf of what other country that might be, but I do think it's important, once again, to have the ability for those local governments to be able to do business and meet their needs of their constituents. And if this bill does not address that sufficiently, perhaps that's something that can be looked at.
Further questions? So and also at page 10, by definition, it says any party that violates this section shall be deemed to have caused pecuniary harm to the state. So how can you deem a pecuniary harm without investigating it to know that there's some type of pecuniary harm?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I wish I could answer that question for you, but unfortunately I cannot.
Okay. Any further questions go ahead, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to that question, how do you calculate the extent of that harm?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, again, I don't pretend to be able to answer that question.
Okay, we can give Nephi off the hook here for a little bit. Any other public comment? And everyone that wants to speak, come on up and sit down so we know who wants to speak. And I see that the good senators here to come up. We've kind of,
You're okay. You can stay there.
yeah. So Bo, go ahead. However you want to handle it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not sure how far down this road you are. We were still in session down there in the Senate, so apologies for not being here to present the bill. I guess I'll stand for any questions. I'm assuming you walked through the bill and what it does. I'll just tell you, the whole idea, the purpose of the bill is real simple. If you're engaged in an economic boycott against fossil fuels, firearms, or any of these other industries, ag, you don't get to do business with the state of Wyoming. We're using our massive purchasing power along with other states who are in the same situation collectively to use our purchasing power to fight back against this economic warfare that's happening against fossil fuels. The whole ESG gamut, whether it's climate related, whether it's social justice or governance. This provides states a way to fight back against that. That's what this bill is intended to do, is just simply say, if you are actively engaged in these boycotts, sorry, but we're not going to do business with you. There's plenty of other options out there. And then there's also that escape clause where if there are no other options, obviously we have to do business with you until we find a different option. So that's the bill, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
So Senator Biteman, as I read the bill, my problem isn't the issue. My problem's the construct of the bill. So maybe you can help me there a little bit. So like on page 3, when we go through there, we say banks and insurance companies, okay, we identify 2 entities, are increasingly denying finance to creditworthy companies. So that's a third thing, to market their environmental credentials. So is there referring to the creditworthy companies or the banks or their insurance companies?
So you're in the findings, sir?
So on line 14, where it says market their environmental, who does their refer to? Does it refer to the bank and insurance companies, or does
Yes.
it refer to the creditworthy companies?
The banks and insurance companies.
Okay, well, I wouldn't have, thank you.
Are denying financing to creditworthy companies to market their, meaning the bank and insurance companies' environmental credentials to the detriment of consumers. So take a Bank of the West, for example, that doesn't want to do business with coal anymore. To market to prop up their ESG scores or whatever virtue signaling they want to do. Okay, Bank of the West, you can do that. But if you're going to boycott coal, you don't get to do business with the state of Wyoming. There's lots of state contracts. Other banks would love to have that business. They're open for business. Unfortunately, by the stance you take has consequences. So yes, you may get a higher ESG score and you get patted on the back from all these, special interest groups, but the states of Wyoming can not do
So
that.
then come with me further down there, then on line 18, where it says pressuring corporations. Are those the same corporations that we refer to on page 2, line 12? Because we're in the same section.
So institutional investors are divesting from entire industries and pressuring corporations.
And so are those the
Commit-
same large corporations that we refer to in line 12?
Line
On
12.
page 2, under the same subsection?
So numerous American industries are being targeted for boycotting and divestment and sanctioning by large corporations and public and private institutional investors. And then you're trying to tie it back to,
Well, that's what I'm trying to do, is trying to figure out because you refer, we refer to corporations several places in here, and I can't, but they're not really defined what these corporations, who, I don't know if it's the victim or the bad guy.
so
Here.
what we're trying to say is your little confab in Davos, you have all of your elite world bankers getting together.
Well, I know, but
You're interrupting me, sir. Can I answer a question or you just want to?
The answer is, you have to answer. If you're not answering the question, he can help guide you.
I'm trying to answer.
So the answer is wait till he finishes his question.
Okay. Proceed.
So then if we could, Senator, and I apologize, I'm not trying to, I really do. I apologize if you feel I'm butting in, but if you just allow me to go to page 4 on line 9, when we talk about there again, we have a reference to corporations are boycotting and sanctioning essential legal industries, which I would assume also would be corporations. But so help me understand. I'm just, as I read the bill, I'm not able to differentiate. It's the same word, but I don't think the intent is intended to be the same. So I'll be good. I won't say, so can you help me through that?
I will try.
Okay.
Here we go. So the use of the word corporations is used pretty broadly. I agree with that. We could insert entities if you would like, or companies. Semantics here is, I don't want to, we're in the findings of the bill. It doesn't even pertain to the actual meat of the bill. So if that's your point of contention, you can certainly amend corporations to say entities are boycotting, because that's the whole point of the bill. The whole point of the findings is pointing out what's happening, what the problem is, what we're trying to solve. and going into the meat of the bill. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Representative Simmons.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Biteman, I share your concern about the economic warfare that is being waged against the fossil fuels industry and against the firearms industry. I share that concern. With this bill, I'm also concerned about what may be potentially unintended consequences. So at the risk of making the rest of the audience hear this for a second time, can you walk me through what it would mean, say, for a municipality that wants to do a new water treatment plant and they need to buy pumps and all sorts of electronic equipment and may want to buy it from, say, European companies that frankly, none of whom may be willing to sign such a verification because they may be under sovereign compulsion from their own countries to go green or to be against firearms. Is it your position that it's just worth the economic price that will not have perhaps the best, least expensive components, and we'll just end up paying more for our water treatment plants, for example, that won't work as well because they have, you know, maybe not the best appropriate fit? Is your position that it's just worth it to, you know, economically boycott large sectors of the corporate world, both domestic and international?
So, Mr. Chairman, if I understand your question correctly, so this hypothetical company is actively engaged in a boycott of one of our protected industries?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And maybe under sovereign compulsion because their government may be telling them, you must go green. You cannot support the fossil fuels industry, say.
Mr. Chairman, so then is this hypothetical company, are they a monopoly or are there other alternatives?
And Mr. Chairman, under this hypothetical, which may not be so hypothetical, would be that they would be one of, say, a small group of people providing very specialized equipment, right? And the municipality, for whatever its own purposes, may want the design, may want this particular filter or this particular pump or drive or whatever. And is it your position then that it's worth it to get something that's not as good, not as appropriate, and that costs more so that we can remain sort of pure?
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
this bill is pretty straightforward and we don't do businesses with companies that are engaged in these boycotts unless there's no other practical alternative. So in your hypothetical, there's probably an alternative. If there's not, then the escape clause in this bill would kick in. So, you know, we can do hypotheticals all day. I understand your concerns, but I feel this bill is written in such a way to protect the state and its interests. And it's also, you know, on both sides, we got to protect our interests with our core industries that are under attack, but we also have to protect, in your example, from boxing ourselves into a corner, or like the chairman said, cutting our nose off to spite our face. So I'm trying to thread that needle here.
Go ahead.
So, Senator Biteman, if you'd, I was trying to ask Nephi this earlier, if you go to page 10 on section C and D there, and I'm trying to figure out in section C, the Attorney General or the District Attorney may enforce this act, but then in D, we only allow if the Attorney General has reason to believe, and I was wondering why the District Attorney was left out of that.
Not included in D.
Yes, on line 13. They're both included in C, and I didn't know why.
Yeah, I would think that that would be an oversight on my part to not include the county attorney.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, further questions? Go ahead.
Senator, nice to see you this evening. I was wondering if you could give me any insight onto the decision on page 8 at the very bottom, line 20, to exclude a company with not less than 10 employees. Just interested. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sherwood, that is a placeholder. I had to pick a placeholder at some point and just use 10 employees or $1,000. So it can be adjusted up or down, however the body sees fit.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up to that question. You could call it a placeholder, yet this bill's been through a Senate committee and 3 readings on the Senate. I would say by now it should be vetted as to what that should be. If this were in the drafting stages 2 months ago, 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, whatever, I get that it's a placeholder, but by now that should be buttoned down to where you would have a reason why you have chose 10, why you have chose $1,000. I don't see this as a placeholder. I think a decision was made because this is, like I said, halfway through the process. So I'd like you to elaborate why you picked 10 employees, why you picked $1,000.
Mr. Chairman, obviously I picked a good number because it's made it this far without anybody bringing that up. So I would just, it's kind of, I think dealing with LSO, I asked them to try to look at our other statutes and conform this into what we already do. And so 10 and 1,000 seems to be common practice with our LSO drafting principles. So that's why we went that way. And obviously it hasn't been an issue at all.
So, Mr. Chairman, follow up. So can you expound on what other areas of our law and statute that we use 1,000 and 10, just that they're basing that against, just trying to get some background so we understand, was it out of the clear blue sky or was it actually founded in something?
I will get with my drafting attorney and get back to you on that.
So, Senator, what I'm curious about is, my guess is, out of the Fortune 500, almost every single one of those companies would be in violation in one fashion or another of the way this bill is currently crafted. So if we invest in any of those companies, we would have to divest ourselves of those investments because we can't sign contracts with them.
Mr. Chairman, that's actually not accurate. Texas passed this same law, I believe 2 years ago. It's been in their books for 2 years, and I think they've only identified 17 companies that would fall under this active boycott scenario of all the Fortune 500 companies, everybody. So there's only been 17 companies that actually are engaged in these active boycotts.
So I've looked at the Texas law, and it's not the same as this one.
It's
It's simply not.
This bill is modeled after the Texas law, tweaked to fit Wyoming statutes. That's how we drafted it.
Okay, further questions from the Senate? Seeing none. Other public comment? Come on, anyone? Go ahead. Mr. Overman.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about this very important topic. So, Mr. Chairman, PAW is supportive of the drive behind these bills, if not necessarily the bills as currently drafted. The topic is so important as it relates to Wyoming's role in the current ESG investment fad. I call it a fad, not because investing in solid environmental stewardship or innovation is new or passing, or that investing in companies with solid governance structures and social engagement is new or passing. The trouble with ESG, as it's come to be defined in current popular parlance, is precisely that there is not an agreed upon definition. Representative Larson may ask me to spend some minutes talking about what ESG is. Turns out it's pretty difficult to do. Good performance on ESG, whether it's investment performance or corporate performance, is in the eye of the beholder. And let me tell you, there are lots of beholders on the international, national, and state and local level. It's subject to all sorts of activism driven by political and partisan moods of the country. And unfortunately, that vacuum is filled by the current political climate driven by a certain type of politics that insists that the environmental, the E side of ESG, can only mean one thing: the complete elimination of carbon emissions and immediate transition to other sources of energy, no matter the societal cost. More broadly, that the social, the S, can only mean support for certain political causes, or it doesn't matter what you've done. or that the G can only be satisfied by meeting very specific diversity, equity, and inclusion goals or criteria, or it doesn't matter what you're doing. So what if, Mr. Chairman, the E and ESG everyone was focusing on was actually centered on the types of investments that have helped to drive the aggregate emissions in our industry down 86% since 1970, or that have driven carbon emissions down by 32% over that time? What if the S everyone was focusing on was centered on the investments necessary to ensure the nearly 1 billion people in the world that have no access to electricity were brought out of energy poverty? What if, Mr. Chairman, the G everyone focused on was simply on, quote, acting ethically, thoughtfully, and responsibly in the pursuit of value creation, unquote, which is from the ESG statement of an oil field service called Liberty. I submit we'd be having a very different conversation today if those were our focus, but unfortunately, that's not the world that we find ourselves in right now. The activist ESG whirlwind we find ourselves is what's creating pushback, manifested in part by the bills before you today. So from the Petroleum Association of Wyoming standpoint, we support the intent of the pushback offered by the bringer of these bills, but we're concerned that the bills themselves go a bit too far in curtailing the types of investments we all might want. Investments towards the kinds of activities I mentioned above in a general sense, but let me give you 3 specific examples. Jonah Energy in Sublette County, Wyoming, in November of 2022 announced that it had reached a purchase agreement with a major utility in the United States, priced at a premium because Jonah had executed a methane reduction monitoring and reporting program that allowed them to differentiate their product as sustainably sourced gas. Pure West, another gas company in Sublette County, was recently named an ESG top performer among private E&P companies. Crestwood Energy Partners, a midstream company, has initiated a continuous methane monitoring pilot project in the PRB, and on and on and on. These are all necessary and helpful in ensuring that your oil and gas industry can remain viable and competitive. If you choose to move these bills forward, I have suggestions on both of them to make them more focused on the problems we face and to allow for investments for ESG related work that is not entirely driven by activism. But what I want to make clear is that while these bills may go too far for some, there is much to activist driven ESG investment that Wyoming should engage on. Wyoming is no wallflower when it comes to investment decisions. PAW members have an active interest in how the PWMTF is invested, given that it's entirely populated with mineral revenue. Mr. Fleming and others maintain that his goal is to ensure that Wyoming's investments get the best return, and I 100% believe him, even though the jury is way out on whether specific ESG investing outperforms other investments, either in terms of financial return or in terms of environmental outcomes. But that doesn't mean that the managers of Wyoming's investments have our state's economic health in mind. Let me give you 2 examples. There's an activist investor group called Follow This. Follow This, one of the things Follow This did is they offered a resolution on what's called scope 3 emissions. I'm not going to bore you with what scope 3 is. Essentially well, I guess I will bore you a little bit. Scope 1 is emissions directly related to your work. Scope 2 is emissions from your suppliers and other sort of indirectly related to your work. Scope 3 is emissions that everybody who uses your product. And so what Follow This did is offered a resolution to the Chevron board that would require Chevron to reduce their scope 3 emissions. Now we can have a long debate about that, and some of my members might disagree about that. But the point is that the logical conclusion of an oil and gas company reducing scope 3 emissions is reducing oil and gas production. Mr. Chairman, many of the top asset managers, including ones that manage Wyoming's investments fund, voted for that. On behalf of Wyoming's investments, some of our managers actively work towards things that are detrimental to our economic health, similar to the Engine 1 efforts to place dissident directors on Exxon's board over the ejection of Exxon. That was voted for by many of the managers that manage Wyoming's investment funds. So it's bigger than just the question of, do we have access to managers? Will we have any sort of, will we have to take a sacrifice in terms of our investments? At the end of the day, Mr. Chairman, I think that we should be entitled to a little more knowledge about and control and influence over how Wyoming's investments are used to advance certain causes. Wyoming has the 5th largest sovereign wealth fund in the US and the 37th largest in the world. We can and should push back on activist-led portion of ESG investments while maintaining our ability to invest where it makes sense. If you decide to lay these back, Mr. Chairman, I'd suggest that the issue be taken up in the interim, and PAW would like to see them taken up by the Capital Finance Committee. No offense to this committee, Mr. Chairman. But we suggest that because we want to focus on the specific topics with the most important nexus to Wyoming's industries and economic health. Wyoming's investment portfolio should not be the arena for every single cultural battle. So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just want to answer a couple specific questions about the bill and offer some suggestions in case you want to try to move them forward. I ignored on 159, Mr. Chairman, I ignored the findings and moved right by those. Do with those what you will. I simply want to point out that on page, first of all, on page 5, line 22 is the line that indicates a little bit cumbersome, in a cumbersome way, that line 22 is without violating state or federal law. What they're talking about is boycotting any industry for not doing more than what state or federal law requires. Many of my members do more than what state or federal law requires. So, Mr. Chairman, if you turn then to page 6, lines 10 through 13, these are the criteria for oil and gas companies. And I would suggest if you move forward that you strike all of line 10 and the word or on line 11. And then start the sentence with does not commit. And then on line 11, strike the word meet and replace it with exceed.
Replace it with what?
Exceed.
So would you read,
So what-
would you read that in, Mr. Chairman? Would you then read your new language in the context of the existing?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So it would read, does not commit to exceed environmental standards or disclosure criteria to eliminate, reduce, offset, or disclose greenhouse gas emissions. And Mr. Chairman, the reason why, again, is because many, if not most of my members already do exceed state and federal laws in order to reduce emissions. And we want to ensure that investments can still happen in that arena. What the bill is trying to get at is forcing companies via economic boycotts and otherwise to do more than what federal state law requires. So you pick out a company in Wyoming that is not exceeding federal state law. You're trying to, the bill is attempting to not punish them for not committing to do more than what is required of them. So we're trying to balance that.
So, Pete, as I read this, the way it's written now is any environmental standard. It's not directing that these are federal or state environmental standards.
So that's why, sorry, Mr.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, so that's why you have to go back to the definition of economic boycott on lines 16 through 22 on page 5. Economic boycott is without an ordinary business purpose, refusing to deal with, et cetera, limit commercial relations with or change or limit activities of a company because the company, without violating state or federal law,
So
does not commit to exceed environmental.
So just to go back though, those are all ors. So they're disjunctive. So that's just one disjunctive in that sentence. And so it doesn't apply to. That's just one limited criteria of what that definition of economic boycott is. It just means any commercial relationship that limits activities of the company.
I'm not sure I disagree with you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that we have a disagreement there.
Go ahead.
So moving on, Mr. Chairman, lines 15 through 19.
Page?
I'm sorry, page 6, lines 15 through 19, I would strike. Lines 21 through 23, I would strike. Lines 15 through 19, of course, deal with the governance structure based on protected categories designated by 27.9.105. This is about punishing companies for the makeup of their board. I don't necessarily disagree with that. My point on that is that if the committee wants to move forward with these, and if Capital Finance in the interim wants to move forward with any of these, they should be separate topics in the way that Texas separated oil and gas from firearms in their bills. Let's talk about each one of them under their own merits and decide whether our investments should be limited or there should be some work there. The 21 through 23, you can see exactly what that is. Mr. Chairman, moving on all the way to page 9 on the out clause. So let me read to you real quickly the Texas out clause. A state governmental entity is not subject to a requirement of this chapter if the state governmental entity determines that the requirement would be inconsistent with its fiduciary responsibility with respect to the investment of entity assets or other duties imposed by law relating to the investment of the entity assets. That's an out clause, Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Chairman, we must have adopted that governmental entity definition from the Texas law then, huh?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know. I wasn't part of drafting this bill. But there are sentences and words in this bill that were pulled from Texas. But there are significant sentences and words in this bill that are not in the Texas legislation. And I'll get to another one of those momentarily.
Thank you. And the only reason I say that, Mr. Chairman, is I thought I wondered why they use that governmental entity and it goes to discover anything when we have in our Wyoming law a public entity that covers the same thing and it would have conformed. So I think that answered that. Thank you, Pete. Go ahead, please.
Last, Mr. Chairman, on page 11, lines 6 through 11, the remedy and the 3 times damages, I would suggest that you strike. Not being allowed to participate in Wyoming's contracting is penalty enough and should probably be enough to, and has been in the case of Texas, has been enough to encourage change by some entities. The last thing I'll mention, just to answer the Representative Walter's question, the 10 or more full-time employees is in the Texas law, but the value threshold in Texas is 100,000, not 1,000.
So Pete, I'm curious, why would they not include sole proprietors? I mean, what's the logic of that? And why would you include nonprofit entities? Some of the most largest companies that we do business with are nonprofits. Probably have more aggressive ESG policies that we would then continue to be able to do business with. And to me, that I don't understand the logic of only doing for-profit companies.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the question. And again, I didn't draft the bill. So what I've offered you now is ways that I think you can make it better. But there, you raise a perfectly valid point. There's perhaps more that should be captured, or more that should be thought about with respect to the definitions of who is captured.
Well, and then just to follow up on that, lots of for-profit entities have subsidiaries that are nonprofits that do certain things that are emailing us an area or some other form of public good that, or they perceive it to be. But this would capture all of those entities as well. Is that how you read it?
Mr. Chairman, I don't disagree.
So Pete, as you was going through the and sharing the interaction that our good PAW members have in their stewardship, a question come to my mind. Do any of those corporations have an ESG policy?
Mr. Chairman, of course, and the ones I gave you examples of have them readily available right there on the
Thank
website.
you. I assumed that maybe that was, but thank you.
And that's the, Mr. Chairman, if I might, that's the distinction I was trying to make, is what exactly are we trying to get at here? I think what we're trying to get at is activist ESG. And that and what I'm trying to get across, and probably very poorly, is that what I want this committee, and if it's this committee in the interim or KevFin or whatever, that we take that seriously, because as Mr. Cole said, it's not a theoretical harm. It's a real harm. Maybe these bills don't solve it quite the way that maybe I would have drafted, but I don't want them to be just swept under the rug as if there is no problem. that because BlackRock has lots of investments in oil and gas companies, doesn't mean that they don't take actions contrary to our interests and that we should be involved in that.
Okay, further questions? for Pete? Other public comment? Go ahead. Identify yourself. Fire away.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I have issues with the mic too, so don't feel so bad. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, and yeah. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Devin Brubaker, Airport Director for the Southwest Wyoming Regional Airport. I appear before you in my usual role as on behalf of the Wyoming Airports Coalition, and tonight in a new role just temporarily on behalf of the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. We have concerns with this bill due to the lack of clarity on our ability to implement the provisions contained within it. While we appreciate the out clause found in the bill, we are concerned that the out clause contains terms that may be difficult to interpret and utilize. For instance, economically practicable seems to us to be very subjective and ambiguous. The out clause also contains a requirement that the governmental entity needs to provide their determination in writing. Who is a government entity to provide that determination to? And finally, when is the government entity allowed to make the determination? Can it be made before solicitation of bids and proposals based on industry knowledge? Or would it need to go out to bid, determine there are no viable bids that comply with the requirements of this legislation, then reissue the solicitation without the requirements? In the case of the latter, an already burdensome procurement process could become even more so and could result in vendors not submitting a second bid or proposal, thereby indirectly increasing the cost of goods and services. Mr. Chairman, we also have concerns regarding the burdensomely low threshold of $1,000. Especially with recent cost escalations, there are very few goods and services that we were able to procure under $1,000. Furthermore, we have concerns regarding the penalty that would be assessed should a company violate their certification, and would support the amendment proposed by PAW to eliminate that clause. And finally, Mr. Chairman, we have concerns on how this bill will impact airports' ability to follow federal contracting guidelines that require award to low bidder without a political test. This legislation appears to require a political test. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I guess my final question to the committee, we heard testimony tonight that there's less than two dozen companies that participate in economic boycotts. Is it really worth all the effort and risk that we passed on to local airports and municipalities to avoid business with just 16 companies? Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Any questions? All right, thank you for your testimony.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Brubaker, thank you. Can you think of a specific example of how it might affect what you do or how the regional airport is run where you are?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, I can think of dozens and I'll spare you, but the simple example of who our email is hosted by as a government entity here. I know the states is hosted by, I believe, Google. Our local at our airport is hosted by Microsoft, all which have very strong ESG policies. The other one that is very challenging to us is air service. Our partners in the airline industry specific to airports have all adopted net zero goals. And while I know this bill does not stop companies from having those goals, I think it speaks to the activism that was talked about by PAW. Those companies are not trying to be activists and try to stop doing business with the state of Wyoming. They're trying to make sure that they're doing the right thing for their business enterprise. And it's not just one airline, Mr. Chairman and Representative Stith. It's every airline in the world at this point has adopted these policies. So it will impact our ability to have contracts with these airlines. I can tell you every contract that we sign as an airport, and I imagine as the municipalities as well, could be impacted by this, especially with the $1,000 threshold. Simple things by buying paper on Amazon, office pack on Amazon, or janitorial supplies, it could be impacted adversely.
So I'm going to interrupt just for 1 second. We've got, in addition to 159, we have 172, and then we also have 144 scheduled for tonight. So and it's almost 7 o'clock now. I don't think there's any way we're going to get to 144 tonight. So if people are here for 144, we're going to move that till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Otherwise, we'll be here till midnight. So I'm just letting everybody know that. who was here and waiting to work on 144. All right, with that, we'll give a chance for people to leave the room before we start continuing testimony. And I apologize for making you guys be here and wait for it, but okay, and Jackie, would you notice that up? Okay. All right, we'll continue public testimony. Go ahead, Patrick.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Patrick Fleming. I'm CIO for the Treasurer's Office. I would like to comment today primarily due to only in regards to what our mandate is and what is promulgated to us by the State Loan Investment Board, which is to achieve the highest risk-adjusted return. In that light, a couple of the issues that we have with the bill, and what I did is I sent the bill to some of the largest managers that we have and said, would this be an issue with you? And the response that I had was there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity in the bill, and they weren't really sure in many of the definitions. And they said if we, could understand more of what they were a little tighter legally, and their attorneys looked at it as well. But the other component of it was
So
the
just 1 second. Hey, Tim, could you shut that door, please? Go ahead.
was the damages that were associated with the bill, the 3X. So it is wonderful that there is an escape clause or whatever you want to call that clause in there for us to do it. But the way it is written now, all of the responses would that they would not sign the bill from the way they're looking at it. So yes, we could sign the contract saying, yes, we want you to come, but they would not do so. And there's been numerous comments. It's like there are so many fund managers out there. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of fund managers. So you just go, oh, we'll find a different fund manager. But the problem that we have is what we term first quartile fund managers. And I'll just use the private equity area as an example, because that is where it is most stark. So the first quartile fund managers, which means the top 25% of the managers out there, you'll say, okay, well, that means there's a boatload of them. But the majority of these fund managers are closed for new investment. They will not take, they're already full. So then we look at the ones that are open, that are starting a new fund, and they say, okay, and we basically have to beg and plead to be able to get with them. So we start off and saying, hey, if you'll ever give us a shot, we're the state of Wyoming, we're stable money, blah, 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 blah. And that has worked well. Over the years, we've been able to get into these top quartile managers. We actually have 3 of the top 10 right now that over the last 10 years. The problem is the difference between first quartile and third quartile, as of the last study I saw was about 3 or 6 months ago, is 6%, 600 basis points. Please realize that we are trying to get every little basis point for our investments. 1 basis point is $2.5 million on the total fund. So when you're talking about across the board of just going from one fund manager to another fund manager, even if it's 5 basis points, it's a significant amount of money. So those are the things that we have concerns with, is that if the managers would not sign these contracts with us, then we would be in a world of a different investment return world. The other component, which I don't know if Dawn wants to speak about, but is our custodian, JP Morgan. So JP Morgan is only really one of 2 large managers that could do the work that we do for a 25 billion entity. It's not like just going out and getting somebody else to do this. What they have to do is, for every stock that we buy, for instance, they have to have correspondent banking relationships and clearing arrangements with Greece, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, just go down the list. And it's extremely time consuming and expensive to do this. So we would not, that would definitely fall within the escape clause from our side. But what if they said, no, we can't sign this on the other side of it? So this is just a couple examples of the unintended consequences that we'd have, both of from our clearing component, from our trading counterparties, and also from our current asset managers that could potentially fall within this. As I said, I am not trying to comment any other belief than what I'm trying to get is the highest risk-adjusted return for the state of Wyoming. And that is only the comments that I'm making in regard to potential impediments from achieving that regard, which has been entrusted upon the investment staff at the STO.
Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman,
Mr.
Mr. Fleming, thank you. If on page 9, line 10, if we added the word fiduciary so that it read are inconsistent with the governmental entity's constitutional, statutory, or fiduciary duties, we did that, and then the treasurer's office were to, make a finding that it's going to just exempt itself from this regime as a result of that completely, is that a workaround that would work for you so that you wouldn't have to ask any of these fund managers to sign any kind of verification, because the agency would be exempting itself from the law, this bill essentially? Would that work?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, if I understand you correctly, if our managers, custodian, banking relations that we have and rely upon, if they would be excluded from this bill completely, would that work? Am I correct in your question? Then yes, that would work from my standpoint. I will have Dawn Williams if she has any other thing to add from the banking operations and so forth. Would that be the same for you?
Mr. Chairman, yes, Representative Stith, I believe so, but there is still that problematic section on page 11 with the the penalties. Page 11, lines 6 through 11. As CIO Fleming mentioned, the discussions that he's had with some of our managers, regardless of whether you add that extra language on page 9, they're not interested in doing business with us should this language even be a remote possibility for them.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, just a clarification. Are you saying only on line 9 or the entire bill? I was alluding to the entire bill. If we were excluded from the entire bill.
Mr. Chairman, the idea would be to make whatever language changes you needed to just sort of exclude the state treasurer's office and the investment portfolio from the bill period.
So let's just do an example. What about your new computer system and the operators of that computer system? That's not part of your fiduciary concept. But if they have a policy, then you can't work with them anymore. You can't sign new contracts.
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly right. And on behalf of all the other agencies, they would be in the same boat with their systems. What about the Wolf systems that's going through an upgrade? That's a statewide accounting system. There's any number of systems that we have in the state that would potentially be subject to jeopardy under this bill.
As I read this, that would include Google and Microsoft. Let's go ahead.
So if I may, Dawn, and I don't know if it's you or Patrick, if I may, just knowing you've had to have had some of these conversations. We're an energy producing state. It's energy that generates revenue that allows us to invest. And so as these issues have started, ESG stuff has started to come forward, what conversations and how has that been received as you had these conversations and the challenges it presents to us? Any enlightenment you can share with us there?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, that's a great question because there is a lot of comments about, what people say, especially Chairman, I'll use BlackRock, for example. The chairman is very vocal and it is very different from what they say and what they do. And I mentioned this in the Senate hearing that if you look at actually what BlackRock does is they, at the time, which was about 2 months ago, I asked them, what is your total exposure to energy producing companies? And at the time it was $292 billion that they invested with these companies. proxy votes, which we will talk about in 172. They're one of the very few entities that actually allow you to either vote your own. You can have an outside entity vote for you, or you have a menu of various options to vote. So that would be an example of somebody that has that in our conversation with all of our managers. And it's part of our investment policy statement that they must follow, that their number one goal is the highest risk adjusted return. And I have told them, if you are putting your own, any ideas or anything else in this because of your chairman's view, then we will not do business with you. And so, for instance, BlackRock, for instance, they own a coal company in a small cap stock that we have. There's not that many publicly traded coal companies that, that they could own, but they do own one. The other managers own similar to what the index would be, which would be about the same amount that BlackRock owns, about 4% of their portfolio. Energy as a percentage is about that amount. So it's very consistent with that. It's not like our managers are actively looking at it and saying, we will not. They can't. I mean, our index funds that we invest in, if you did not include the energy sector, you would have massive variance in your returns. No one would invest with you if you had these deviations from the index. That's what their job is to be spot on to the index. That's all they do. So those are, it's a bit of a misnomer to say that some of these entities would adjust in that way. So many of the companies that we talk to, we just reiterate, will you invest our money in the way that we want you to do? And in every SLIB meeting that we've had with a new manager that I can think of over the last 2-3 years, the treasurer and the governor specifically focuses on this issue and we'll ask them, what is your policy? Will you not invest in this entity because of any of your beliefs? And every single one, they're like, absolutely not. No, we want the highest return. That's where we're going to get the money is investing in the highest return. And they will grill these managers and make sure that they are not trying to boycott any industry specifically.
Okay. Any other questions for Patrick? Dan.
Chief Investment Officer for the Wyoming Retirement System, here with Ben Brandis, who is our counsel. And I think we have a number of similar concerns as Patrick over in Treasury. And I think it might be helpful to address one of the questions that Representative Stith brought up, if you don't mind, regarding the fiduciary issue.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Ben Brandis, General Counsel, Wyoming Retirement System. Representative Stith, on your point on page 9 and line 10, adding fiduciary duty, that's a change that we would support. Certainly our board and the retirement system very concerned, about the impacts that this has on its execution of its fiduciary responsibility. That being said, we're also concerned about other legislation that's currently pending that would amend some of the statutory provisions related to the board's execution of its fiduciary duty. And so we just want to bring that to the attention of this committee as it contemplates potential changes, both to this legislation and other bills that may be pending.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So yeah, I think one of our major concerns is that ESG is defined so broadly and pretty subjective. If you look at some of the other states' bills, it might say no boycotting of fossil fuel companies or gun companies. And that's very easy to define. But in some cases, it's defined so broadly here that if a company has a statement about being supportive of diversity, for instance, that might be enough to get them put on the do not invest list. And I think to your point that you brought up about Fortune 500 companies, everyone having something that might restrict us from investing. I think I agree with that. Earlier today, I was looking at the webpage of a very large coal company, and they have a page about their climate focus and how they're going to reduce emissions, and they disclose emissions, and they're going to get to net zero at some point. I'm not sure how a coal company would do that, but theoretically, we wouldn't be able to invest in a coal company, which I'm pretty sure is not the intent of this bill. So I think in general, if the definition is so broad, it really narrows down the managers that we can invest with. It's very likely to have some cost. So over the last, it's hard to quantify that, but over the last 3.5 years, we produced about 550 million of outperformance, and 3/4 of that was from manager selection versus asset allocation. So anything that's going to restrict the number of managers we can select is potentially going to have a negative cost and potentially pretty substantial.
Okay, any other public comment? Come on up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Travis Detai with the Wyoming Mining Association. And a lot of good discussion here, and I will be very brief. I would kind of piggyback on what my colleague from the Petroleum Association said. We believe it's important to push back against some of the stuff that's going on. Whether or not this is the right bill, I suppose that's still up for debate, but we would certainly support seeing this issue go over to the interim. But we do think it's important that this body do something. Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions.
Questions for Travis? Make it easy for you, huh? All right. Scotty.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Scott Meyer with the Wyoming Bankers Association. And I also will not belabor a lot of the points. There's just a couple of things I wanted to bring to your attention. There was a bank that was mentioned that's unfortunately not one of my member banks. It's affiliated, it's throughout Wyoming. It's affiliated with the bank out of Canada, and have made strong ESG policies, and they don't want to invest and they don't want to deal with anything like that. You have to be careful though a little bit on some of that pushback, because in some of our smaller Wyoming communities, that is the only bank within 100 miles. And so trying to be careful about where we're going to go with some of those banks and how they deal with it will in fact impact those communities and those municipalities as they deal with it. The other thing too is that while I listened to Mr. Fleming and I had to laugh a little bit to myself, is that, yeah, there might be some options. None of your Wyoming banks, your community banks can backfill on this baby. It's just too big. So we have to rely on the big banks to take care of that. We just don't have the capacity to do that. So stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Well, and all of those big banks that you rely on all likely have some type of ESG component.
Mr. Chairman, they do. And when you start grilling them as to where they are, so I know where my association is. Some of them don't have really too strong of a point, but some of them say yes, but we will bank extractive industries fine until they're ready to transition out. Well, maybe I don't think Wyoming is ready for you to transition out. But I think that you're exactly right, Mr. Chairman. Every one of them has a policy.
Okay, questions for Scott? Representative Steve.
Mr. Meyer, if you know, Texas apparently did adopt some version of this in 2021 with respect to energy companies. Any idea how it's playing out there?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Stiff, there has been some out there that have some organizations that have taken their stand, and the state has taken their position, and especially with respect to bonding. I noticed that the bonding companies said we're not going to do business here, and they've left. The reality of that is that has caused some of the more smaller municipalities to not have the bonding companies available to them and the banks to back them up. So the interest rates are much higher than what they've normally done.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
we do have a Randy Eminger online.
Okay, any questions for Scott? Go ahead.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm just trying to get your take, still trying to understand some components of the bill. Have you got the bill handy on your
Yeah.
seeing there? If you'd turn to page 9, been trying to get my head around the intent of that language in 95404, where we say no person. I realize person can, but I'm trying to understand, maybe are we thinking that person, public entity, or who that person is that should take away? As you read that, what was your take on what that section A was trying to do?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, it's a bit vague when I look at it at that time right there, but no person shall take any action that penalizes or threaten to penalize any financial institution for complying with this act. I don't know how to interpret that, any action. Like I said, I think it's a bit vague on there, but I think that what they're trying to do is make sure that if financial institution is taking a position to comply with this act, that you can't penalize them. So,
thank you, Scott.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't read the last name.
Imminger.
Go ahead, Mr. Eminger.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. My name's Randy Eminger. I'm with the Energy Policy Network, represent coal-fueled electricity that uses Wyoming and Powder River Basin coal. I just take a quick minute to say that this, the ESG is real. There are examples of where it has adversely impacted coal companies, not only in Wyoming, but across the US. If you'll look at the bylaws and you look at the annual report of BlackRock, State Street, a number of these companies, fund managers, it specifically says you will agree to the Paris Agreement. You will look at joining Climate 100. Basically, what they're saying is that you'll agree to be carbon free by 2050. What we found is, in some cases, they've even, one coal company was looking at borrowing 150 million and was told that they would be lent the money if they would get off of coal in the next decade. In other words, stop doing business, stop mining coal within the next 10 years. I'm just trying to say that this is real. It's happening out there. We have lots of examples of oil and gas companies as well in Texas that have been hit by this. We found that the two largest funders of American Electric Power, which is the largest utility using coal in the US, has been told that they need to start managing down their coal plants. You can decide for yourself what managing down coal plants means, but in our view, it means you'll start retiring on a more rapid basis, the closure of your coal plants. I would say there's a couple of provisions in here that I would like the committee to make sure they're aware of, specifically the last sentence of the bill, which says this will not impact any existing contracts that are out there. So Mr. Fleming, that's looking at long-term contracts 4 or 5 years, if they're in place now, this bill does not impact existing contracts that are in place, only those going forward. There's also an out, as he talked a little bit about. We absolutely do not want any state to lose money. That's not the purpose of this. That's what we want, is for them to lose, to get the highest return they can. And I can tell you the 5 states that have passed the bill, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas, West Virginia, are basically they can tell you they're not losing money at this time, because there are other options that are out there and a lot of opportunities. Also, I'd like to say, I know the banks, when you look at the banks, there is a provision in the Kansas bill. We have 17 bills introduced across the US right now, but the Kansas bill basically has a threshold of it only impacts banks of with assets of over $20 billion. So it really just impacts the larger banks. We do have one Wyoming coal company that was told by Wells Fargo they had to stop using their credit cards, that Wells Fargo would no longer supply corporate credit to that company. I guess the one thing I would end up with is that when you look at BlackRock, sure, they have 292 billion in fossil fuels. A very small part of that is in coal. The rest of it's all primarily natural gas. And that's out of $8.5 trillion that BlackRock has. So when you hear that they're out there doing things with fossil fuels, I think it's somewhat misleading. Again, we see it front and center in our industry, and we feel like it's something that Wyoming should seriously consider. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Mr. Chairman, we do have another person.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Who's next?
Brent Bennett.
Go ahead, Brent, if you're there.
Mr. Bennett.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes. I'm Brent Bennett. I'm with the policy director with the Texas Public Policy Foundation down in Austin, Texas. I've been following this legislation and wanted to join to speak from some of our experience implementing this bill in Texas. Very similar legislation that we passed 2 years ago in Senate Bill 13. That and just kind of I think go over some of the concerns that I've heard and expressed in the hearing here since I've been on. Apologies if I missed the first part of the hearing, so apologies if I'm repeating anything that's been said already. But I just want to kind of, I think, reiterate what Randy said, which is that, you know, the goal here is really the policy goal from the perspective of when we passed our bill is really to bring out the conversation and to bring into the light what's going on with these boycotting inclusive activities, and to make companies respond to that, and to have some pushback. I think there can be short-term switching costs that we've seen in terms of, having to choose different bonding companies and so on. We've had so far in Texas, we've had 5 companies that have at least temporarily left the bond market. Only Citigroup, because of our firearms bill, actually. So we have 2 separate bills for firearms and energy. Because of the firearms bill, Citigroup has actually been denied participation in some of our bond markets. They were taken out of actually a big bond issue to securitize our debt from the winter storm 2 years ago. But we've not heard from any entities that they've had trouble finding other groups to, competitive bidders on their contracts. We have over 60 companies that participate in our municipal bond market, and five have left, but only one has actually been excluded. Like I said, Citigroup. We have, on the energy side, we have 10 companies, BlackRock being one of them, that are on the boycott list. But again, there's a lot of exceptions to allow for, again, a lot of discretion with regard to, if you can't obtain, and I see similar language in this bill, if you can't obtain the services elsewhere, et cetera. So I think that that what it has done, again, so there has been, I think, some administrative and switching costs with regard to figuring out different entities, right, to work with. But so far, we've seen the competitive market responding here, and especially across as other states adopt these policies, right. And I think that it becomes very clear to companies that they need to change their activities, or there's new competition that steps in. So I think the key for every state is to find what's that right balance between, the long-term benefit of, pushing back against these companies and as Randy pointed out, getting to the heart of what ESG is doing to our industries, and maybe some short-term switching costs between different entities. There's been some, studies that have shown that there are costs to this, but we haven't really heard from our municipalities a lot of pushback. Like I said, that they've had trouble with that. So I think again, the committee should really consider that I think most of the language in here is very sound in terms of allowing for discretion. And that is, I think, the appropriate approach. And again, I'd love to answer any questions you might have about, again, specific implementation items or things that we've dealt with here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Instant.
Mr. Bennett, you mentioned the costs. Has anyone quantified the costs to Texas of its adoption of these two statutes?
No one in Texas internally yet. There's we spent a few $100,000 in terms of administrative costs to build out. We had in the energy side, we actually had a list that was created. So that took some cost. You actually don't do that here in this bill as I read it. It's merely, companies sign, as part of the contracts, they sign and say certified they aren't boycotting. And actually, you have to have a positive finding of boycotting in order to deny a company a contract, right? So I haven't heard of any cases where a company has just not there. I guess I said there's five companies we found that at least for a while were cautious about signing the contract, but all eventually did, and only Citigroup was positively found as in violation. There might be more over time, but that's all we've seen so far. There's been a study out of the University of Pennsylvania where they tried to kind of use some modeling to estimate the interest costs so far, but they're really they only have 1 year of data, and so they try to take that 1 year data and extrapolate all the way out for at least 10 years from now. And so it's, there's really hard to say, there are people that are trying to show that it costs a lot of money, but like I said, we haven't heard that internally from a lot of our state agencies, municipalities so far. And we also have a really long experience. I don't know if Wyoming has is the anti-BDS legislation related to Israel, but we've had a long history of implementing that and pretty successfully so far over the course of 6 years.
Okay, further questions for Mr. Bennett? Go ahead.
So, Mr. Bennett, thank you. I'm just interested. We don't bond much here. I'm looking at my investment guys, and you suggest that Texas does a significant, well, I don't know if it's significant. Could you give us an idea of maybe how much you would have out there in bonding that you're covered? And then could you maybe just share with us on your investment side through your fund managers and stuff, what is Texas's portfolio?
No, that's a great question, Representative. So yes, we have a very large municipal bond market in Texas, and that's really the piece of our legislation. I guess the biggest market impact of our legislation has been there. Again, there hasn't really been a significant impact to state agencies simply because they either have options or if they don't, they take an exception, or there's, like I said, there usually has to be a positive finding of boycotting in order for a company to be excluded, right? So there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of good debate, but there hasn't really been so far a lot of exclusion that's been happening. And what the bills have done have brought out that discussion. On the investment side, we have, I guess, 10 companies that are on the list for energy, and some of those companies like BlackRock provide investment services. In some cases, our investments have taken the fiduciary exception to continue working with BlackRock, particularly in the case of illiquid private equity funds, private equity transactions that they've done. In the case of mutual funds, it's generally very there's a lot of competition out there, and so they've been able to find good substitute products. I also would cite the case of Florida has done a lot with regard to, and this is kind of getting into, I know there's a pensions and investments bill that's corollary to this that your legislator is considering, but since you asked about investments, Florida's actually done a good example of actually they've moved some money away from BlackRock, but they have maintained a lot in there. And what they've done is they've created separate managed accounts where they don't use the ESG overlay that BlackRock applies to their active investments. And they also get to vote their proxies their own according to their own standards. And our pensions have been adjusting to that as well. They've been starting to change their proxy voting standards and work with, they haven't fired anyone. They're just working with the companies that they have to implement different investment standards. And so I think that's really the goal is, there's some cases where it makes sense to move money and you can do so easily in the case of very liquid funds. Some cases it does not make sense to do that. And so then there's discretion there to maintain. And again, the discussion that's been brought out by in Texas has been really, I think, very helpful and worth the time and effort of implementing our legislation.
A follow-up question is, for set aside the investment stuff, but just enter into contracts. Here we are in Wyoming with 560,000 people, a suburb of any town you have in Texas almost. And then just the contracts, and I think you're at $100,000, just any contract that any municipality or the state that enters into that's over $100,000, and you have a process. Tell us how you do that to where, it could be from paper to garbage cans, frankly. And how do you get that information? Do you do it on an RFQ at the beginning? Do they self-report? How do you?
Yeah, it's basically an item in the contract that has to be signed, right, by the entity signing the contract. And so again, they sign certifying that they aren't boycotting, and then only if the state has a positive finding that the company's boycotting can they really be excluded, right? Or if they're put on, or if in the case of the energy legislation, if they're put on the list, the list of boycotting companies. Same thing goes. There's also a list for Israel, for companies that boycott Israel as well. So it's implemented in the RFP process, and we have a process for that in our state. I'm not sure how it's done in Wyoming, but in our state, the comptroller sets the procurement rules that are implemented by the state agencies. So it's mainly centralized through his office. And then there's the municipalities have their own systems, but again, I was actually surprised that they set the bar as low as 100,000 for Texas, because that encompasses a lot. But so far they've been able to implement it fairly successfully. So again, for every state, I think it's every state that I've worked with on this legislation, it's kind of finding the right cost benefit trade-off, right, for each state as far as what limits are set and who's captured, under the kind of who's captured under the bill, right? So it's definitely unique to each state, I think, as to where the bar should be set.
Thank you. Further questions? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Appreciate it. Any other public comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Any other comments? Any other public comment? Anyone else online?
Terry Tharp.
Tharp?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Tharp? Mr. or Mrs.?
Terry Tharp, go ahead.
Does he need to click on anything?
Yeah, he is in.
Do you need to admit?
He's in. Terry Tharp, you just have to unmute your mic and your video. There we go.
Video. No.
You were there for a second.
Okay, am I on?
Yes, please proceed.
All right. I'm not going to take up much of your time, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Terry Tharp. I live in Gillette, and I'm a member of the Wyoming Retirement Plan. I want to say with regard to the bill, Senate File 159. I'm going to echo a lot of the comments you've already heard. After reading the bill, I think it could substantially impair the states and the universities and the local government's ability to enter into contracts with other businesses. The language in the bill is pretty vague, and it could result in a lot of unintended consequences. The bill reads like it was put together pretty hastily, and if you do anything with it, I feel it should be referred for an interim study, because things like this take more time than I think what a session of the legislature has. And the one last thing I have to say about that bill is I'm especially concerned about the treble damage provisions in section 95404. And you've already heard from several people. I agree. I think it will scare companies off. And it really has no relation to any actual damages the state might suffer. Now, with regard to 172, and I'm going to keep this brief, that again will impair the state's ability to invest, and the language goes way beyond what it should. And I guess the question I have is where does this end, and who's next on the list of companies that we don't want to do business with? If it's passed, it can always be amended, and in future years, there may be other amendments dealing with other companies. So that's my take on it. And at this point, I guess if you have any questions, I'll stand for questions.
Well, thank you for your comments. If it was a little earlier, we'd have you play a little sonata for us on your piano behind you, but we don't have time.
Well, my wife plays the piano. I don't, so you wouldn't want me to play a sonata.
Okay. All right. Any questions for Mr. Tharp? Okay, seeing none. Any other public comment? One more?
It looks like Michael Steadily. Oh, thank you.
Here. How do I get off of this? Leave.
Okay, Michael, go ahead.
Are you able to hear me at this time?
Yes, please proceed.
Very good. I'm not sure why my camera isn't working, but that's all right. If it were, I don't have a piano behind me and I can't play a sonata, but my Cocker Spaniel might have made an appearance just for everyone's entertainment. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the gifts of your time and the courtesy of listening to my comments. I promise I won't take much of one, nor will I abuse the other. I wish to speak against both of these bills very briefly. I won't take much of your time. I view the two as measures which might sound quite good in principle, but which in practice could have some very drastic and incredibly harmful, to use a phrase that other people have used, unintended consequences. And I'm going to address specifically the Wyoming retirement system, which relies not just on the contribution of its members and their employers, but relies a great deal on the return of the system's financial investments. If these measures pass, I'm afraid it would have a very drastic effect on both the quantity and quality of the investments that the Wyoming retirement system could make. Essentially, I see these measures as effectively tying the hands of the retirement system investment team, limiting them to investing only in those entities which don't annoy the businesses of the state of Wyoming. No shrewd investor would voluntarily submit to such limitations on behalf of one of his clients. Their fiduciary duty of the retirement systems investment team is to maximize the return on the investments that they make with the members' money. I believe that if these two measures pass, the Wyoming retirement system's return on the investment might suffer irreparable harm. And by extension, one could reasonably argue that it would affect the retirement income of literally every one of the over 40,000 members of the Wyoming retirement system, perhaps irreparably and immeasurably. Thank you very much for the courtesy of your time.
Thank you for your comments. Any questions? All right. With that, any other public comment? Seeing none, we will close public comment. Okay, committee. Discussion on the bill. Moved by Representative Larson, seconded by Representative Stiff. Do we have any amendments? Any discussion? Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, to start, top of page 9, lines 1 and 2, replace $1,000 with $100,000.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, that motion carries.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I would also move on page 9, line 4. I get there are a lot of different ways to do this. We'll start with the easy one. Page 9, line 10. Replace the phrase entities constitutional or statutory duties with the phrase entities constitutional, comma, statutory or fiduciary duties.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, that motion carries. So committee, before we continue to walk down this path, just a general comments. I think that the committee in general is entirely in favor of some type of action with regards to ESG and establishing a state policy. Our problem is not so much with the message as it is the messenger, which is this particular way that this current bill is drafted. And for example, just having 4.5 pages of findings and the findings themselves are incongruent and inconsistent. And also, I think in some instances, quite misleading and mischaracterize some of the facts. And so as we walked through trying to figure out a way to amend the bill after reviewing it over the course of several days, it was the general consensus that we would come up with a substitute bill, because otherwise the bill was simply unmanageable and unreadable once we did it. And so with that, could we have a motion? Mr. Chairman? Go ahead.
I do have a motion and I'll read this. It'll be and maybe before I read it, I'll kind of share the intent for the sponsors of the bill and the public, is that we think that this is a very important topic, and we think that we need to do some interim conversation on it. We need to get the parties involved, and maybe if this moves forward, it could be put as something that we could expand on as if this bill makes it through the process and adopted. But what it would do is it would go into 95401, and it's under state contracts and preference for companies for not engaging in economic boycotts for discrimination when feasible. And in its pretty simple language, it says, to the greatest extent possible and when feasible, each state agency shall, when entering into a contract for goods or services, give preference to companies that do not engage in economic boycotts or discriminatory practices against firearms or fossil fuel-based energy. And this act will apply to all contracts entered into or on the effective date of this act. And that would be my amendment if I have a second.
Move in second, discussion. And so, as I understand it, and is that there's a general consensus that the ESG concepts will go into interim committee and likely be with Camp Finance Bill. We'll be able to come in and take testimony similar to this, but go into fine detail and go through all the other states' current ESG bills and kind of disseminate them and to figure out what fits and what doesn't fit for Wyoming and develop something, a mechanism that is the least economic impact to the state, but also definitely lays out what our goals and intentions are, addressing the issues similar that as Kansas, Kentucky, Texas, and Oklahoma and West Virginia have done. But the concept is that this bill probably doesn't meet that purpose and we don't have time to fix it. So the substitute bill will basically go into place and through the interim process, we can fine tune this and add to it, subtract to it, and follow that process, just so the bringer of this bill understands what our kind of our objective and goal is here tonight. So any further discussions on the substitute bill?
We want to do.
Okay.
Mr.
Any-
Chairman, is the substitute bill something that we have in writing, or is it just what Representative Larson read?
I believe we've gone through 2 or 3 different iterations, but it's the same one we passed out this morning. So I don't know if we have any copies of that. So we'll take a little pause here so we can distribute it to make sure everyone has a copy of it. You got the one for 171. I didn't get it. What did it change? It's the same one. It's the same one. Yeah, make sure everyone here has one. Anyone else like a copy? And we'll make more if anyone else needs it. Okay, there's more copies for everyone who wants them. Okay, since, Senator, since you just saw it, why don't you, if you want to come up and comment on this draft, please do.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I've never seen this happen before. To say I'm disappointed is an understatement. To treat a sitting fellow legislator like this in a public committee, which is actually a public execution, not a public committee, but nonetheless, to spring a substitute bill on me in committee without me even knowing about it, seeing it, I just say shame on you. Just vote it up or vote it down, but to do this after hearing all the testimony and to pull this on a fellow legislator is, it's not okay. That's not how we do business around here. I would certainly never do that to any one of you.
Mr. Chairman.
And so that's all I have to say. I don't support this. And if this were to pass, I'd ask that my name be taken off as a prime sponsor.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Question for the bringer, if he wouldn't mind. As you read what's in this, really, this to me appears to be the summation of your 11-page bill. We accomplished the same task in a simpler, more concise manner. Would you disagree with that?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. This bill does nothing as written. It's absolutely does nothing. To the greatest extent possible, this bill does nothing.
Okay, whoever just got a copy of it, if they have public comment on it, we'll open that up as well. If you choose to. Any other public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment again. So the amendment has been moved. All those in favor of the substitute bill, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, that motion carries. Back on the bill. Any other amendments? And I think this takes care of your original amendments that you already brought. Seeing none, go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman, is the understanding then that this will be an interim topic or suggested as an interim topic as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay,
So, Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
with this being the substitute bill, I would make a motion of do not pass
The motion of do not
on the
pass.
substitute bill. Excuse me, on the bill as amended.
The bill as amended. So the motion is do not pass as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Roll call.
Roll call. So the aye is to do not pass, correct?
Representative Henderson. Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood. Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Representative Swanitzer.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye. Okay. Next is Senate File 172. Senator Biteman. Actually, before you speak, let's take about a 5-minute, 10-minute break because we've been sitting here since about 5:30. So,
Actually, Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say, seeing the will of the committee, what's the point of even hearing the next bill if you're going to do the same thing to it? So is there a substitute bill for that one too?
There is,
There is?
there is.
Okay, then I have nothing else to say.
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break. Well, we can, and we'll be back. Okay, we're back in session. In front of us now is Senate File 172. And we have circulated the draft bill. So is anyone? Any comments on the draft bill? And so, you know, the same discussion that we had for 159. Essentially, we have the same issues with 172. And so what we did was we simplified it. We made it specific to get this bill through and out of the legislature in the next 10 days. And then we'll take this same issue up along with 152 up in CapFin, which I'm the chair of. And I've had this discussion with the good senator from Sharon that we will take these bills and these ESG issues under as our interim topic as one of them. And so basically this is a gap filler to address the issues, just to demonstrate we're sincere about it, that it's important to us, and that we're going to take the next steps as we move forward. So briefly, Mr. Vice Chair, would you any other public comment? Any other public comment? You betcha. Yeah. Mr. Treasurer, welcome. Thanks for hanging out with us at 8 o'clock.
Oh, heck yes. It's been a relatively long day today. Yeah. I don't remember when I got up. It's been that long. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to talk briefly about 172. The big part of that bill that I really wanted to try to get our teeth in to is proxy voting. You heard that from the gentleman from Texas that they're doing a lot of proxy voting. We've done we started out with 1 basis point. That was a lot more money than we needed. I think we could probably do it for around 1/4 basis point and have some left over. But I'd like to get somebody to actually help get you information and do the research that would make your job productive this summer. Because essentially we've gotten a lot of folks, and I want to thank you guys for that, but they've all been accountants. And Matt Sackett doesn't have any more bandwidth in his area, and Don is doing HR now and other things because we lost our HR person. So we're still, those folks are basically full. We still don't have an attorney or even somebody that's been sent over from A&I for us to interview. So, we don't have that bandwidth to take it anyplace else unless we get another person, at least one. I wanted 2, but I'm begging for 1 right now, and enough to look at entertaining some contracts with the 1 or 2 of the firms that do proxy voting, and to actually have to go through every one of our different managers where we know that we might be able to do some proxy voting. It won't affect our private equity and things like that, but there's things there that we're going to need. We're going to need a few tools in the toolbox to get this moving through, even if it's just for contracting with an outside analyst or an outside position, to get the information that you guys need to help us, move through this process of how we effectively address ESG.
And so, Mr. Treasurer, I think that's a great idea. I mean, the more information that you can put together for CapFin as we go through the interim on how many folks do what you just described for the proxy votings, how many large investment entities or sovereign funds in their contracts require the ability to have that, and what the costs are across the board on how you do it and when you do it and the most economical way to do it. So we're looking forward to working with you and if then push comes to shove and get it done when you need another investment advisor, we'll likely give you one because we love you so much.
Oh, well, Mr. Chairman, this really is an investment advisor. Patrick and I had that discussion about this is somebody that's gonna, help with the proxies, not so much with the investments. I think that we're going to be looking at our 5-year plan coming up, and that will probably look at some investment advisors and some different things that we want to, try to look at, see whether we do that. But we won't get the cart ahead of the horse. We want to make sure that the counting system is totally, fully operational and all different modules are implemented before we start looking at building out the back office. So this has nothing really to do with the investment side. This is primarily just focused on proxies. And we don't have an individual that can do that or has the bandwidth to do that.
Well, and then what we'll want to know is, my understanding is there are companies that do that.
Yes, that's
and
right.
whether
Yeah.
it's economical to,
Yeah.
which is the most practical and the most logical.
And we think there's probably somewhere around 100,000 would probably get that done, where when we were first talking about it, it was somewhere between 300 and 600,000, but we've done some more looking at it, and we think that in that range should take care of that. And then we need probably a mid-level type analyst position that would be able to focus on proxies and to try to get the
So-
information that we need.
And to follow up on that, so what we would like you to do is when we have our first cap fin meeting, is bring to us basically the entities and the companies and basically go out and solicit proposals and show us those proposals so we can know exactly what they cost and what they do.
I guess we can go in a letter writing campaign, Mr. Chairman, and write to
Well,
our managers and.
You should do that anyway.
And
because-
use some ink in a word processor, but I don't know how much we're going to get back. It won't be as much as if we had somebody that was dedicated at it.
Okay, go ahead.
Treasurer Meyer, thanks. And just kind of coming back to the topic at hand as we get ready for this interim topic. I think that the message that we've got out there to you and the retirement board is, these are the industries that keep Wyoming plugging along. And we appreciate the challenge that they have with the CSG push and the restrictions that it places on them. And so we really need to know what we can do to help them within the parameters that you guys need to invest for us on. But, thank heavens they've been there for us. And I think what goes around comes around, and we need to reciprocate some of that effort to try and help them with the financial pressures they have on them to comply with stuff that, frankly, as Pete mentioned, they're already doing. And so if you can, I just think we can get there, but we need your help to understand what we can do within the parameters that you have to operate, please.
Yeah, I think that WRS, where they could probably make some headway, and this is interesting that BlackRock is now trying to get ahead of the ESG problems that they've created themselves with giving some flexibility and proxy voting. I'm not sure what they're doing with the life path that we have at WRS, but I think is that close to 500-600 million now in life path funds?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
About 450 million in life path funds in the 457 plan, and those are all BlackRock. So those are things that we can look at as far as seeing what we can do with contacting them and seeing if they've opened up the proxy voting aspect of that. I think there's places where we can go ahead and implement it without a lot of problems, and there's other places where if we're going to implement anything, we may have to change managers, but we're going to have to look at the fiduciary aspect of that, because more likely than not, when you ask somebody to do another service, they'll ask you to pay them for it. So we'll see if we can get some cost benefit relationships to the proxy voting on some of these.
Thank you. Okay, questions for the treasurer? Appreciate your comments.
Yeah.
Other public comment? Representative Store.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know it's late, so I will be brief, but I just thought I'd try to offer a slightly different perspective on the challenges the state faces in figuring out how to manage its investments, especially, and applaud all of you and many members of the House and Senate in the work that you've done to improve the investments, as well as Mr. Treasurer. So we've heard a lot about reasons to avoid ESG investing, and I just thought it would be educational to provide one small example of what it looks like in the case of the Storer Foundation, which I'm the president and CEO of when I'm not here at the legislature. So it's a 67-year-old family foundation that's been in Wyoming for 36 years. We're much smaller than the state of Wyoming's sovereign wealth fund, but we also have a 5% spending policy as mandated by the IRS. And like the state of Wyoming, we manage for perpetuity. So there are some similarities. Our mission is to promote an ecologically rich and economically prosperous future. And with that radical idea, we do think that managing risks is part of what we look at when we manage our portfolio. So we have actually grown our investments in the ESG and impact area over the last decade. We don't think that's inconsistent with our highest risk-adjusted returns. About 44% of our total portfolio falls into either impact or ESG. We do recognize at the Storer Foundation that climate is a global issue, and we do look to reduce emissions and mitigate those impacts. But we also do other things because we care about education, we care about building sustainable communities, we care about addressing health and poverty and a lot of other issues. So I just shared with you some pages out of our 2021 impact report that our managers provided for us. The first page has our annual returns for our impact investments. The top half is about the investments in the public markets, and the second part is the private markets. Those are obviously longer private equity investments that take place over a decade or so. But as you can see, we've done quite well. And we believe we will continue to do well. The next page just talks about how we look at those impacts. And again, there is some information about lowering carbon emissions, but we also look at things like more efficient water use, less waste generated, environmental restoration, and just improving energy efficiency. So those are some of the things that how we measure these investments. The next page is related to the S and the G parts. Again, we do a lot of work in early childhood education funding. And so looking at daycare, training, and looking at ways to have greater diversity is just something we do think it is quite valuable. So I'm not suggesting the state of Wyoming needs to think about that necessarily, but I do think it's important for the state to think about what the state's investments goals are. And I think you'd be surprised to see some of the kinds of investments that our approach to impact investing has provided. One is on the next page. Payne Schwartz Partners, it's a global leader in sustainable food chain investing. It helps enhance agricultural productivity. And it just recognizes that consumer preferences are shifting towards healthier and safer consumption. So we've done quite well with their Fund 5. that we've just been in for the last 4 years or so. One of the investments in that group is something called Advanced Agrilytics. It's based in Indianapolis. Again, they try to help farms be more efficient, use less water, be more productive. So I'm not convinced that, I think ESG is not inconsistent, clearly with excellent returns. And in fact, somewhat quite the opposite. As a legislator, I do think we need to take a pretty holistic approach to our asset management here at the state. I do think 172 as currently presented would really impact the state's ability to diversify its interests through the investment portfolio. And I do think an interim process that would help develop guidelines that are consistent with the state's goals, recognizing both our traditional industries and that we likely face a more diversified future would make sense. So I encourage you to move in that direction. Thank you. Any questions?
Questions for Representative Storer?
Thank you.
Okay, any other public comment? Any public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Do we have a motion? Move the bill. Somebody? Moved by Representative Larson, seconded by Representative Stitt. Do we have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment. If I have a second, I'll explain what the amendment does. So on the first page of the bill, I think that those of you that have it are on page 2, getting into we go into the definitions and identify what an investment entity is, and that of course includes our treasurer, our state loan investment board, retirement groups, and then we go and we define what the state funds are that are under investment. We identify that in making and supervising the state funds investment, the entity, the investment entity shall to the greatest extent possible solely in the financial interest of the beneficiaries, and that's carried out through C, D, and E, F, and G on page 3, where we take into account only the financial factors when discharging the duties and investing state funds.
Okay. We have a motion on the amendment?
We moved and seconded. We just need to vote on it.
Okay, moved and seconded. Further discussion? Any questions? Roll call. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Those opposed, that motion carries. Roll call. Go ahead. Yeah, the motion is do not
Mr. Chairman.
pass. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move on the bill a motion of do not pass as amended.
Okay, roll call.
Representative Henderson. Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood. Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Walters. Representative Swanitzer.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye. Okay, that concludes our evening. Just for those who didn't hear, because of the late hour, we're not going to do Senate File 144 tonight. We'll convene 8 o'clock. Is this room empty at 8 o'clock?
Yes, we will have the meeting here.
So we'll meet here at 8 o'clock to continue our work on Senate File 144. Stand adjourned.